welcome to our weekly edition. We are normally here talking about secret societies, but we wanted to take the opportunity to introduce an in-depth look at the Vatican Bank, since the Vatican has been in the news lately. And I am joined, as usual, with War Hamster Brady. How are you doing today, Brady?
I am doing well. Looking forward. We've been trying to get this show together for a while, ever since the Pope passed away, and the schedule's been tough. But I'm glad we could make this happen today. And it's not that big of a diversion from what we normally talk about, because it's really about who really runs the world, how they do it, and why. And the Vatican Bank is a bit, it's a big part of it. Shall we jump in?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to start with an article from the Wall Street Journal. Came out last week. And let me just do a quick screen share. This is before we got the new Pope, Mr. Leo the 14th. And they did not know, but the name of the article is "The Vatican Financial Mess Pope Francis Couldn't Fix." And we'll read a few paragraphs of this to get you a general idea. It says, for over a decade, Francis had struggled to bring some transparency to the Vatican's shadowy balance sheet. Now, in the final weeks of his life, advisors were filtering in and out of his austere reception room, presenting the details of a microstate awash in priceless treasures, but tumbling deeper into debt. The budget deficit had tripled since the Argentine took office, and the pension fund faced up to 2 billion euros in liabilities it wouldn't be able to fund. Now, it's an interesting thing about Vatican finance. They talk about very priceless treasures, everything from the Sistine Chapel, paintings by Michelangelo, etc. The Vatican Bank has a mass amount of priceless art and work, and they value every single one of these at about €1 on their balance sheets because they never plan on divesting themselves of their treasures. So they can't use it as an asset to borrow against. So when you look into the Vatican Bank, that's something that's very important to remember, or the Vatican itself. They really, a lot of their riches, you've heard of something that's priceless. Well, these are priceless for two reasons. Either very valuable works of art, but they'll never sell. That is the intention. And I think if they ever do use them as collateral, I think it'd be a very messy situation. Continuing on, the first Jesuit Pope was exhorting clergy to live frugally, but pinching pennies alone would not relieve the financial crisis facing the seat of the church. The Vatican was increasingly relying on museum ticket sales to fund its civil service, its worldwide network of embassies, and the Papal Swiss Guard, a small army paid in Swiss francs. The city-state serves 7 million visitors a year and a global flock without collecting taxes. Now we'll go through the history of the Catholic Church's finances today. And just so remember what they just said right there, they do not have a tax base. After more than a month of discussion, Francis settled on one solution: ask the faithful for more money. Talk about 12 years ago, the new Bishop of Rome was Francis, a pontiff elected with a mandate to fix the Vatican's finances. But the first pope for the New World wasn't prepared for the degree of resistance of the Curia, as the Vatican bureaucracy is known, his close advisors and allies said. He hired a professional auditor to modernize the finances, leading clergy to move Vatican funds into an account under a cardinal's name and stockpile cash in a shopping bag. Not the kind of behavior you really expect out of your priests. The auditor was mystified that nuns kept account ledgers in pencil and paper. At one point, intruders broke into his office and tampered with his computer. Eventually, the gendarme corps of the Vatican city-state got involved. Let's do another paragraph. Professional accountants, encouraged by Francis, ran training workshops for clergy who balked at the rules, like obtaining multiple sign-offs for expenses. Prelates tried to hide funds from scrutiny, citing national security concerns for the secret ledgers of funding missionaries in countries where proselytizing is a crime. Other departments shrugged off the modern-day challenge of balancing the budget of the papal state, whose origins stretch back more than a millennium. The Pope himself shifted focus to other topics. Meanwhile, the pension fund kept falling further behind. Scandals over a $400 million real estate investment, we'll get into that later, ended with a cardinal being convicted of embezzlement and fraud in 2023. That's really a pretty good crux for where we are today. I mean, for where the bank is today.
And can I just make a statement on one of the things that you just highlighted? I find it interesting that the Vatican claims national security, in air quotes, as a reason why they can't reveal certain information. Because as the expert in Gladio portion of this, the missionary part of the Catholic Church has always been used in addition to spreading Catholicism as an intelligence agency. And we found that throughout all of our studies, whether it was in South America, whether it was in Vietnam, when the Catholic Church got in bed with the OSS and then the CIA to use missionary Catholic churches and missionaries to forcibly migrate 1 million Catholic Vietnamese to South Vietnam as part of the beginnings of Operation Phoenix. So revealing where these missionaries are would be able to trace them to potentially destabilizing activity and an intelligence network that they're not going to want to reveal to anybody.
Very good. And I think the other thing that really highlights that Wall Street Journal article is two really contrasting cultures of modern finance with basically medieval times, religious leaders in robes. They don't want to have to do things like balance sheets, but that makes it very difficult to survive financially in the modern world. I want to go a little bit deeper into the current Catholic Church's finances. You really don't have a single centralized annual budget because it's broken. It's got a very decentralized structure. It's comprised by, you've got the Holy See, which is basically the papacy, the Vatican city-state, and about 2,800 different dioceses around the world, and they're all run their own individual budgets. You got money spread among numerous religious orders, parishes, affiliated organizations like hospitals, schools, charities, and they don't operate with their own budget and financial independence. Big picture. You have the Holy See, which is the central governing body of the Catholic Church and oversees the Roman Curia, the global apostolic missions, and the papal charitable works. It's got the most transparent of the budgets, thanks to reforms under Pope Benedict XVI and Francis. So these are 2022 numbers. Their income was approximately $887 million. That comes from about 65% of self-generated revenue. Big part about that is something called the Bambino Gesù Hospital. Real estate management. Interesting point. Keep your real estate keeping your top of your mind. Only about 20% of the Vatican properties yield any economic returns. So some of them are just, churches or historical sites. They have financial investments and they have commercial activities. They get about 24% of external donations. Part of that's Peter's Pence. If you're not Catholic, and by the way, if we offend Catholics, you're not listening to our show. This is not a religious commentary. This is about the organization of the Catholic Church, and it's got enough scandals in there that we're not, talking about anything new. So get that in advance, and I'm not worried about my soul going to hell for this conversation.
Truth should never be shielded because of who we're talking about.
Yeah, I haven't even asked the colonel what if she's religious or a denomination. It's not the topic. Is religion. Those external donations, Peter's pence, that's basically just donations from around the world that go to the Pope. It goes back to the 8th century. Those saw a big drop after COVID because people stopped going to church, and the Catholic Church shut down a lot of services around the world, and it really hurt their finances because people weren't going there and paying their Peter's pence. And then, of course, the other part of the income of the Holy See is the Vatican City State and the IOR, also known as the Vatican Bank. And we don't exactly have itemized figures for the Vatican Bank, which is interesting. Their expenditures, remember, so their income was not 887 million, and their expenditures are 92.4 million. Well, that's a deficit, and that's how you run out of money, and that's what Francis was trying to fix. But again, this is the smallest country in the world, Vatican City, and they do not have a tax base. So their finances, they have got to get creative. And as we said in the Wall Street Journal article, Francis' solution is give us more money, people.
And let me also say a point that Paul Williams, who is a Catholic, says often. They are a sovereign with the Vatican Bank is a sovereign within a sovereign. So you have the sovereignty of the Vatican City State, but the IOR, the Vatican Bank, is a sovereign within that sovereignty. So there's no visibility into their books at all.
Yeah, very much so. And we'll see that theme come up over and over again when we go through the 20th century scandals, because they were able to cite sovereign immunity. Nobody has the ability to tell the Vatican to give up information. So a lot of investigations died on the vine. All right, the other next part of the Vatican balance sheet, or the Catholic Church, is the Vatican City-State budget. And that's revenue sources from that are the Vatican museums. They generate about 150 million annually from about 7 million visitors. They got post office shop services, and they've got real estate and investments. They own about 4,000 properties, mostly in Rome and Lazio, and that yields about 100 million annually. Their expenditures are the maintenance of St. Peter's Basilica, the Swiss Guard security, and their utilities, but that's assumed to be about 200 to 300 million a year. The Economist had some older numbers. Source called Catholic Link had some more modern ones. I don't know how accurate these are. And then there's the big one, the Global Catholic Church budget. That's about the 2,800 dioceses, about 300 religious orders, and affiliated institutions like Catholic Charities. And they manage their own finances, each one. Estimates are all over the board for this, so these are broad numbers. But you're really talking about $200 to $230 billion spread among those 2,800 dioceses. Most of that's in the United States. And Germany would be the second biggest. Then, of course, there's the Vatican Bank contribution. And as we've talked earlier, Vatican Bank is not exactly transparent. I bring this point home because we now have the first American Pope, Pope Leo the 14th. And it's interesting because a lot of people have been pontificating that the reason for the American is they want to be able to tap into the American contributions, the American Catholic population, which makes a lot of sense. Because, well, if you look at where I got this breakdown demographically. Hang on. The Catholic demographics, world religions, 32% of the world is Christian. Almost half of that is Catholics, about 1.4 billion Catholics. Of those Catholics, 27% are in South America, 14% in Central America, 6.6% are in North America. But that's where they wanted their Pope from, because America is far wealthier than all those others. About 20% is now in Africa, where the Catholic Church is growing the fastest, but obviously Africa is very poor. That's why we got the Pope we got. And Robert Prevost, his former name, is interesting. Born in Chicago in 1955. He's got deep roots in Louisiana with some Haitian and Creole ancestry. Remember what I said about the little juxtaposition between priests and bookkeeping? Well, Robert studied at Villanova, got a degree in mathematics before he studied theology, and went to Rome. Spent most of his life preaching in Peru, but he has been voting in American elections since the 90s. So, interesting guy. We're not going to spend too much time on him, but I think it's really important we point out that it's probably financial reasons is why we got the American Pope. Is because the Catholic Church is in dire fiscal straits. Which brings us to, well, not quite yet. We're going to go into the history of the Catholic Church's financing, because there's a couple of interesting stories there before we get to the 20th century and the founding of the Vatican Bank. And that's where the Colonel is going to tell us all kinds of fun stories. If you want to give, I've got to track down some research here, but if you want to.
Well, I found it very interesting when I did a preliminary look into Pope Leo and his time in Peru, but the fact I caught immediately that he started at the Archdiocese in Chicago, because the Archdiocese in Chicago gave birth to Archbishop Marcinkus, which we'll get into later when we start talking about the scandals of the Catholic Church. But Archbishop Marcinkus was in charge of the Catholic establishment in Chicago and was integral in a lot of the mafia ties to the Chicago mob. They banked at the same bank, and there was a lot of banking scandals back then. And so my radar immediately went up when I realized that he was associated with the Chicago church.
Yeah, and I think, we've had people on all sides of the conversation guessing what kind of a pope he's going to be. Is he going to be as woke as the last one, et cetera? His brothers made some headlines. I think I'm in a wait and see approach. But I understand the thinking of the Vatican itself of choosing him and choosing him very quickly. They are in dire financial situation. So let's talk about how they got there. All right, the early church from like the 1st to the 4th century, revenue sources are mostly voluntary offerings and patronage from wealthy converts. Their expenditures weren't that much. That just wasn't all that expensive to run a church back then. You get to like the early Middle Ages, 4th through the 10th century, the revenue sources are imperial support. After Constantine's Edict of Milan, the church received state subsidies, land grants, and tax exemptions under Christian emperors. That's good business to be in. They had a lot of land ownership, so a lot of estates from Roman aristocrats would donate part of their estates to the church, and it really created a vast network of church-owned properties, generating a bunch of agricultural income. So you see these farming priests. That goes back to like the 4th century. You also started tithing. Mandatory tithing of about 10% became a thing in Western Europe, and it was enforced by the Carolingian rulers, Charlemagne and his descendants. And then, of course, you had the pilgrim offerings. Expenditures back then were mostly clergy salaries, charity, and defense against invasions. So you did have a little bit of a militant. You did have some military spending because they had to protect their people. And of course, some of the biggest challenges back then were barbarian invasions that was going on in Europe or Rome, or the former Roman Empire. We get to the Middle Ages of the 11th, 13th century. Revenues coming from what's called the donation, the papal states, which are established after the donation of Pepin in 756. The papal states provided tax revenue, agricultural yields, and tolls, peaking at about $1.5 to $2 billion annually. So quite a bit of, in today's dollars. So that was pretty good income. They also had tithing, and that's when Peter's pence came along from England in the 10th century. Then they started with the crusade taxes. So special levies would fund the crusades, often collected through the dioceses. here's where one of the nastiest parts of the church history comes in, and it's called the sales of indulgences. Basically, wealthy people would pay essentially indulgence bribes to the church for forgiveness of their sins. So you talk about buying a stairway to heaven. That was going on, and it was controversial from day one. And indulgences are one of the corruption of it was one of the major reasons that led to the Reformation in the Protestant religions. So this is a big deal, and it was a lot of their income. Some of these wealthy aristocrats, they were, and this ties into the whole power structure of Europe back in the day. The first son would inherit the land, the second son would go into the church, and the third born son would go into the military. Those were the three legs of the stool of maintaining power throughout generations through Europe, going back for more than 1,000 years. This is how it worked. They started charging clerical fees. Most of their expenses was papal court maintenance, cathedral construction, like Notre Dame. The Crusades were expensive, and of course, mission work in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Biggest challenges they were facing was corruption, like selling church offices. And also, you had some resistance to papal taxes, conflicts with the Holy Roman Empire. We get to the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and the revenue is still the papal states, about 2 to 3 billion annually from taxes and land rents. Indulgences, which peaked under Popes Julius II and Leo X, which funded St. Peter's Basilica reconstruction. They're doing about 1.5 billion a year in indulgences in today's dollars. This is when they started going into banking partnerships. The church would work hand in hand with Italian banking families like the Medicis. This is the ties to Venice. And they would borrow money to finance wars or art. That's how Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel got built. Do we really want the bank in bed with the church? The question was asked back then as well. Most of their expenditures were for Renaissance art and architecture, papal armies, and diplomacy, basically fighting against the Ottoman Empire's expansion. A lot of good and bad came out of this area. I mean, who was funding the Renaissance? A lot of it was the Catholic Church. Wasn't exactly, shall we say, the cleanest transactions of all time. Now we get to the 17th and 18th century. Most of the revenues are still the papal states. Yeah, Peter's Pence and the global missions. Global missions really took off as Europe started exploring the world. Obviously, the Spanish were one of the early explorers, and they justified their colonialism with basically converting everyone to Catholicism, which is why almost all of Central and South America is mostly Catholic. Most of their expenditures were on counter-Reformation efforts and defense against the Protestant and Ottoman incursions. They fought pretty hard against the Protestant churches.
Well, saying that brings to mind all of the information that I've dug up on the Rockefeller family out of books like Thy Will Be Done, because the Rockefellers were using Protestant missions, like we talked about several times in Hawaii, as a land grab as well. And they were doing in a resource grab. They were doing it throughout South America. Nelson Rockefeller specifically, sending in like language translators under the guise of, hey, we're going to get a Bible to you in your language. But what they were actually doing, they had been infiltrated with spies in order to find out where all of the oil resources were, rubber trees and stuff like that. And then they would go in and wipe out entire villages. So it seems like they kind of were in a competition with each other and not necessarily for the hearts and minds of people or the soul saving.
I think, I think you could very easily say it was a dual mission.
Yeah.
There's a question in the Rumble chat from CN Stewart, and he says, can we equate the Crusades as raping and pillaging like NATO? Well, that's a good equation there. I can play devil's advocate and make the argument that the Crusades were necessary from a Christian standpoint. The Muslim, the Muslim invasion of what's now the Middle East. Most of those people that were living there at the time were Christian, and they were killed or converted. That's how Muslim was practiced at the time. You convert or die. You can make the argument that the Crusades were in defense of Christianity. And you can also make the argument that the Muslims, pillaging was just like raping and pillaging, just like NATO as well. I think the argument is that that's basically been the history of humanity, is raping and pillaging.
Well, and William Gilchrist also says the Fourth Crusade was basically supposed to be addressing the Holy Land part, and they ended up going to Constantinople and sacking it. So, yeah,
there's a great story about that that is probably historically accurate. Venice basically was able to redirect the Holy Roman, the crusading army to Constantinople. And the main reason they did that is Venice was the number one seagoing maritime power in the world. They'd inherited that from they'd been that for centuries, the biggest trading empire. Their biggest competition was Constantinople. Yeah. And they basically eliminated their competition to make that happen. And of course, opened the gates of Turkey to what became the Ottoman Empire. So once Constantinople fell, the rest of what's now Turkey fell very shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
So good question. Thank you for that one. Couple big events. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. And at the same time, Enlightenment, secularism is going on, and that really eroded the church's influence and reduced their European donations. Fast forward to 1789 and the French Revolution. They nationalized a bunch of church properties, slashing their income. At this point in time, the Holy Roman Empire is pretty much gone as a viable entity to have the military power or diplomatic power to control vast swaths of land. And the church is realizing they know at this point in time that their wealth is going to contract. Monarchies started asserting their control of their own ecclesiastical revenues, ecclesiastical, thank you, which set the stage for the modern financial restructuring, which they did. Here comes the big change. And this is going to be one of our points I really want to hammer home. In 1870, they lost the rest of their papal states. What was going on was Italian unification. And what they did is they annexed all of the Vatican's properties, eliminating over $1 billion in annual revenue, and left the church, the only real estate they really owned was what's now known as Vatican City. That was completely changed the financial outlook for the church. Now, it's important we look at the year of 1870, because there are people running around the internet, some well-intentioned, that truly believe that the United States in 1871 was bankrupt and was bailed out, and we became a U.S. corporation, was bailed out by the Vatican Bank, which didn't exist yet, and the City of London bankers. How would the Vatican Bank, which is almost going bankrupt the prior year, buy up the entire debts of the United States of America? They had absolutely no ability or scale or scope to do that. Yeah, mic drop on that one. So the 1871 U.S. corporation theory, I've got a couple of shows out there that debunk it, but this is another bit of proof of that. They just lost all of their income the year before. Okay. So now we get to the 20th century. Oh, another big event. Something called the Lateran Treaty. Lateran, Lateran, in 1929. Mussolini compensated the Vatican with about $92 million, would have been about $1.6 billion in today's dollars. That would be invested by a gentleman by the name of Bernardino Noguera, who was the Vatican banker from about 1929 till the early 40s, or even into that. And he invested it in stocks, bonds, and real estate. Those investments were yielding about $1 billion a year by 1942. Peter Spence became critical with a global diocese contributing about 100 to 200 million annually. Okay, now we get to the modern day. The 1942, World War II is going on, and we get the founding of the Vatican Bank. Why did they found the Vatican Bank? Colonel?
Well, I think it's not a coincidence that in 1942 is when Hitler began their staging a creation of the werewolf units and his entire stay behind network throughout Europe. And the exact same year that the Vatican Bank gets established.
Yeah, that's going to that theory of yours really correlates well with the research I did. So that's why I asked the question. Why did you throw that out there? A little bit of background on the Vatican Bank. It's evolved from something called the Commission for Works of Charity, which is founded by Pope Leo XIII in 1887, which is a quasi-bank. Then it evolved to become what's known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, or the IOR. We'll call it the Vatican Bank. So it's founded in 1942 by Pope Pius II, and its primary mission, this is a quote from its charter, providing for the safekeeping and administration of movable and immovable property transferred or entrusted to it by physical or juridical persons and intended for works of religion or charity. Part of the charter says it includes managing funds for Catholic institutions, dioceses, religious orders, papal initiatives, and ensuring financial support for the church's global mission. Basically, they were trying to protect its assets from wartime confiscation. There's difficulty moving money through the Western banks. And Bernardino Nogueira, the Vatican's financial advisor since 1929, creates the IOR as an offshore bank within Vatican City, which remember we said about a sovereignty inside a sovereign. Because of the structure, it's exempt from wartime financial regulations. I'll say that again. Exempt from wartime financial regulations, and it allowed the Vatican to move assets to neutral countries like the US and Switzerland. Colonel, if you're exempt from financial regulations, does that open up the door to any shenanigans, possibly?
Well, we're going to find shortly that it opened the door up for major shenanigans.
Let's talk about World War II then. What the Vatican gain? What was the Vatican Bank up to in World War II? What kind of shenanigans?
Well, understanding that Hitler, and this involves the Bank of International Settlements too. So, and probably need to just say a couple of words about that. In order, the post-World War I, they decided to set up the Central Bank of Central Banks, the Bank of International Settlement. And so there's a lot of confiscation going on in Europe of all kinds of wealth. And there is a need to move that money around, both physical money and money that had been deposited in the Bank of International Settlements. And it's interesting that the Vatican Bank that had just been set up was also very well represented in Switzerland, which is where the Bank of International Settlements is. So as Hitler's creating the Black Eagle Fund and moving a whole bunch of gold around, because a lot of people don't know this, every time Hitler invaded a country, whether it was Hungary, Romania, or whatever, he picked up the phone to the Bank of International Settlements and told them to move their money, their gold, because everybody had to put an amount of money on gold in their accounts at the Bank of International Settlements. And so the guy at the Bank of International Settlements with his little ledger book just kept moving the assets from Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Romania as France as they toppled each country into the German ledger. And there's going to be a lot of need for the money post World War II because of the rat lines that are going to be set up in the movement of people. And we've just found out how good the Catholic Church are at moving people around, right? I mentioned Vietnam and the involuntary movement of 1 million people. And then we just caught them at the border, moving millions of people into America. They're very, very good, but it costs a lot of money. And so the setting up of the Vatican Bank is going to facilitate the movement of the wealth confiscated in Europe, as well as the rat lines, and then the soon-to-be opium trade.
Yeah, that's all because of the lack of transparency and regulation. Although that was immediately possible. And as you've pointed out many times, when it comes to espionage, the church is very well connected and very well protected.
William Colby is on record saying that the CIA, nor the Mossad, nor MI6 would ever have half the intel collected that the Catholic Church was capable of collecting on an annual basis.
Yeah, I've read that, and it makes perfect sense. And that kind of ties into, we skipped over a few things in the history, and I want to go back to them real quick. First of all, the Spanish colonialism. They had a wonderful deal going. We'll spread you our religion. We'll just take all your gold back to our place. And of course, Isabella and the other Spanish monarchs always got the Catholic Church's blessing to justify, what was basically very cruel colonialism as they raped, pillaged, and plundered. And they were all about bringing gold back home. I've said one of the original mercantilists. It's really where mercantilism really kind of hit its peak or matured before the British took it to a whole new level. We haven't talked about the Knights Templar, Knights of Malta, or anything like that. This is a secret society series, so maybe we're going to go back and touch on them later. I skipped over them today because this is more about the Vatican Bank. So we're not missing that. It's deep enough that this would be a really, really long episode or series if we spent any time on those secret societies within Jesuits, etc., within the Catholic Church. They're there. We're skipping over them for a reason, but we will circle back to them as we go through secret societies because it's important. Fair enough?
Well, they will get mentioned because Marcinkus, when we talk about some of the scandals and all of the intelligence officials that were associated with Operation Gladio, especially in Italy, all were members of the Knights of Malta. And it's another sovereign within a sovereign. So it fits the exact same. And William Gilchrist over on YouTube also mentioned that Pope Leo was inducted into the Knights of Malta like a year ago. So it definitely has relevance to the story.
Yeah, and we're gonna close today talking about some of the Freemason, some of the Masonic connections to the church, and that'll be our closing argument on this one today. So We're not skipping over all of that, but there's just a lot there.
Yeah.
A couple other big scandals from the Vatican Bank in World War II was this is from Gerald Posner's God's Bankers. Have you read that one?
Yes, I have.
Okay, yeah, it's a good one. He talks about how they were profiting from insurance policies that were tied to Jewish Holocaust victims. It's pretty nasty business. And the one I really liked is they were handling the looted gold from Croatia. That is real, apparently. And a case was brought that got dismissed as recently as 2011. And the reason the U.S. court dismissed that case about the Croatian gold was because of the Vatican's sovereign immunity. Smallest nation in the world, but you can't investigate us.
And I don't think Croatia was the only one. That's what I was alluding to. A lot of the confiscated gold got laundered through the Vatican.
Yeah, and that's just, I think the Croatia is just the most well documented.
Yes.
But we've got an insurance scam going on. I mean, all right. Okay. We're through World War II, and we get to the 50s and 60s.
So let's set up the, before we move on, the movement facilitated by the Vatican of the Nazis' exodus out of, and it's interesting that you mentioned Spain as well, because Spain is basically, and Italy, the port of departure for all of the Nazis that the Western powers decide they're going to save and not prosecute. That is where the ports of departure. And how did they get them out of Germany? They dressed them up as priests. They actually put them in priest clothing and smuggled them out of Germany through Spain and Italy, put them on boats and landed them in South America, primarily Argentina.
We're going into the Cold War. The Vatican openly stated that they were going to be funding, direct quote, anti-communist activities. They're in Italy funding anti-communist activities. What else is going on in Italy funding anti-communist activities?
Operation Gladio.
Think there's any connection?
Yes, because as a matter of fact, most of the ties to Operation Gladio emanated from an organization called Propaganda Duo. And that is a Masonic order that is directly tied, because everybody that was a big muck-de-muck in P2, as it was referred to, all got inducted into the Knights of Malta. The Grand Poobah, Grand Mason Gelli, Gelli, who was an atheist, a professed atheist. So not only is the Knights of Malta supposed to be for Catholics, it is, the Catholic Church is diametrically opposed in writing to any Masonic Lodge member being a part of any of their operations. So he had two strikes against him. He was an atheist and he was the Grand Poobah of the P2 Lodge, which, where was their other chapter of the P2 Lodge? In Argentina. And the Gelli was actually inducted into the Knights of Malta at courtesy of the Catholic Church.
Yep. And this is why this Vatican Bank story happens to fit perfectly in our timeline, or the story we've been telling. I think we should probably reintroduce a gentleman by the name of Michel Sindona. If you've been following the Colonel and I, we did a series a while back on the bank, BCCI, Bank of Credit, and boy, I forgot what the BCI stand. Anyways, we talked about the BCCI.
Commerce,
thank
and
you.
Credit.
Thank you.
Sure.
And Michel Sindona was an Italian tax lawyer and banker, and he was known as the banker for the Vatican and the mafia at the same time.
Yes.
We've already established the mafia connection to the CIA with Operation Underworld. Now, Sindona is known for hating communism. He's operating out of Milan, which became a huge industrial hub after the war. And he becomes a banker for rich people who want to hide income. Where he had his banks or his headquarters is right next to Switzerland, Liechtenstein, which is perfect for taking money across the border to evade taxes. The joke was all companies in Italy would have 5 sets of books, one for the taxmen, one for the banks, one for the minority shareholders, one for the board of directors, and one true set of books. Okay, so Sindona in the 50s goes to New York City and builds up some networks, starts working with some New York bankers, gets involved with the Gambino crime family, sets up shop in Cuba, where he works with Batista, and Meyer Lansky was actually involved in that too. Basically, this was a fantasy world for consenting adults, what was going on in Cuba back then.
Well, can I chime in here real quick? This is after the CIA has set up Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, Formosa, in order to start the drug trade. So for those of you who follow Operation Gladio, you have post World War II, actually in the ending of World War II, and in the transition to after World War II, Paul Helliwell, William Pauley, who are both tied to Cuba. William Pauley owned the only airline in Cuba. He owned the bus transportation in Cuba. He owned sugar plantations in Cuba. So this is all relevant. He is embedded with the mafia as well. They have set up a pipeline of drugs coming out of, thanks to Chiang Kai-shek, who they install in China as the president of China, prime minister, whatever he's called. So they have an active multi-billion-dollar drug trade that is set up, and it is going to run through Cuba into the United States. So Brady's conversation about Sedona is critical. The mafia is going to be the last leg of that, distributing it throughout the United States. So Sedona is setting up the financial network to launder all of the covert funds generated from this drug trade. What he just described to you is Sedona setting up this network, because they have to have a way to money launder into primarily real estate, which is why real estate keeps coming up in this conversation. That was normally the end destination of the money laundering until after they put the dirty money in a cash transaction to buy real estate. And Brady, you need to explain to them about how that's exempt from that disclosure requirement as well, just as a reminder that they would park it in real estate and then they sell the real estate and now it's clean money.
Yeah, they had a number of money laundering tactics, and that's what Sedona was really doing, is helping people. What I find fascinating is it's the banker for the Vatican. This guy's the international banker and tax loophole exploiter, is working hand in hand with the mafia, the CIA, and all of this stuff right there. I mean, that's the point I want to hammer home, is that the Vatican is knowingly involved in all this.
Correct.
Well, Sedona becomes friends with a guy by the name of Cardinal Montini, and Montini would become the Pope Paul VI in 1963. So this goes all the way to the top. That's kind of important, that this money launderer is friends with the guy who's now the leader of the Catholic world. We've had good popes, we've had bad popes, and people are torn on which are which. But I think that the case can be made, if you're in bed or you're good friends with a banker for the mafia, you're probably going to end up being one of the bad popes. The problem comes when Cuba falls to Castro. So all this mafia, all this Vatican, all the CIA time and money to set up this drug smuggling, prostitution, and gambling hub of Cuba is now out the door, which leads us, of course, to the Bay of Pigs, etc. And probably JFK's assassination is one of the major reasons. All right, let's get to it. Do you want to finish up with anything on Sedona?
Well, just to say, are you going to say how he died?
I was going to let you tell that story.
Well, he was actually assassinated, but not before he faked his own kidnapping by shooting. He got shot. And there was some difference of opinion of whether he shot himself or he had somebody shoot himself, but he pretended to have gotten kidnapped in order to get a pardon, and asked for forgiveness and a whole bunch of. If you've never researched anything about Sedona, I would highly suggest you do it, because it was a crazy story. Paul Williams' book, Operation Gladio, has a very good timeline of Sedona, but yeah, they end up taking him out. And he's not the only one in the story that gets taken out that is part of the money laundering operation of the dirty drug covert money.
Yeah, Sedona, I should add more flavor to him. But once Cuba falls, the city of London becomes really important. That's where they had the euro dollar. And as I've said before, the euro dollar is really interesting because The United States doesn't have any jurisdiction to regulate it because it's in London. And because all they do is trade in the dollar, the British banking regulators don't have any oversight into it. So basically, the City of London trading in dollars became basically a monetary hub. Half the world's banking went through it, and not all of it was clean. So, of course, Sindona has the Vatican deposit their money in London with dummy corporations. And it's funny, there's a quote. It says, "The servant of the underworld becomes a financier of God." Sindona's involved with the rise of the Bahamas in the 1960s, supposed to be a replacement for Cuba. Didn't quite happen, but they did set up an offshore banking center. Had been there since Prohibition. Meyer Lansky had lost everything in Cuba. He tried to turn Bahamas into Cuba. The U.S. regulators tried to get in there in the 60s, and they installed something called the Sands. This guy Sands installed the bank secrecy laws, so that's why the Bahamas, was hard to regulate. Colombian cartels go into business in the Bahamas. 71 is the year Nixon takes us off the gold standard, and Sindona was trying to purchase a U.S. bank. Franklin National Bank is the one he was getting his fingers into. And at the time, you're seeing in Italy a lot of mafia versus communist violence on the streets. 74, Franklin National Bank goes insolvent, which trickles down through all the Italian banks. In 79, Sindona gets arrested in the U.S. on 68 counts of fraud. Everyone drops him as their banker. He's practically penniless, and as the colonel said, he did not die a happy death.
And let me add in your timeline right there, when you go from 71, it is not a coincidence as that financial phase is coming to an end, that BCCI makes an appearance in 72, around the same time that Nugent Hand in Australia is created. And those two then become the money laundering hub of the drug networks, the CIA, and there's about, I think it was like 23 shell companies that was set up around that same time period for the Vatican in order to do their money laundering more in-house.
Very good. All right, what else is going on in the 70s? Oh, we have another scandal. Let's talk about Banco Ambrosiano and your good friend, Robert Calvi, also known as God's banker.
Yeah.
All right, so here's the background. The IOR, Vatican Bank, holds a significant stake in the bank and Banco Ambrosiano, and it was accused of facilitating money laundering through a web of offshore shell companies, primarily in Panama and the Bahamas. Sound familiar?
Yep.
These companies, allegedly controlled by the IOR, received loans totaling over $1.3 billion from Banco Ambrosiano, secured by Vatican Bank letters of comfort that implied Vatican backing. The funds were reportedly used to launder money for Italian elites, the mafia, and possibly political groups, with some accounts linked to tax evasion and illicit activities. Anything to add?
Yes. So Calvi is very interesting because in addition to Banco Ambrosiano, he created Ambrosiano Overseas. He created Ambrosio Group Banco Commercial, Banco Ambrosio de America, Banco Ambrosiano Holdings, Banco Ambrosiano Overseas, and did business with the Bank of Italy as well. And that was important because the Bank of Italy will eventually try to go after Calvi and get access to the books because there was an interface between the two, even though supposedly it's the sovereign within a sovereign. And are you going to talk about how he dies?
I'll let you do that. Let me get the let's talk about the collapse of the bank first, and then we can.
Okay, go ahead.
Then we can bury him.
Okay.
So Banco Ambrosiano collapses in 1982. And of course, the IOR, the Vatican Bank, denies any liability. But they would pay out $240 million to creditors in what they called a goodwill gesture in 1984, acknowledging their moral involvement without admitting any legal guilt. And again, there could be no investigation because there's no transparency with the Vatican or the bank. They had sovereignty, limited legal accountability. So Calvi gets found dead in London in 1982. Feel free to tell the story.
Okay, well, I'm going to go back just a minute. So I want to draw a couple of parallels that I think our audience is going to find fascinating. Okay, so out of Paul Williams' book, this talks about the principal laundry for the new heroin network remained the BCCI, which continued to retain its primary offices in London and Karachi. James Bath, a CIA associate with the business partner of George W. Bush, remained a primary director. Burt Lance, an American businessman who served as the director of OMB for Carter, emerged in 81 as a key BCCI consultant, along with Arkansas power broker Jackson Stevens, who was one of the major funders of Clinton. In accordance with the wishes of William Casey, the CIA director under Reagan, the BCCI stood alone, financially independent, and free from congressional scrutiny. Thanks to Lance and Stevens, Western Arkansas suddenly became an international hub for drug smuggling. Cocaine being smuggled into the airport in Mena, the BCCI's first American bank, blah, blah, blah. And in walks Clark Clifford into that. But where this all ties in is if you look at what was going on in Arkansas as relates to all of this, with at the time Governor Bill Clinton, in walks the BCCI's front in the DC bank, Kamal Adam, and he was the CIA's principal liaison for the entire Middle East. So all of this stuff is tied to this. And then we get to 1985, BCCI is the international $23 billion operation a year, and it ties back to the Vatican Bank. It says that there were Catholic priests in Chicago, namely Archbishop Marcinicus, that was tied to all of this money laundering that was going on. And you have the Rothschild Bank in Zurich tied to it as well. So then you get to Blackfriars Bridge. Why was Blackfriars Bridge important? Because of the name of it, number one, because the black robes was symbolic. Now, you understand that when the joint mafia CIA is going to take somebody out, there's tons of symbolism used in the execution, so no one mistakes who's taking them out. So not only did this chubby little banker get thrown off Blackfriars Bridge with a rope around his neck, he had Masonic stones in his pocket so that they know who did the hit. Well, of course, immediately it gets classified as a quote unquote suicide, which later on gets reopened several years later as it actually being a murder. And he wasn't the only one that was taken out. His secretary was thrown out of a window on the top floor of the bank that they worked at because she had all of the details of all of his shenanigans and access to all of the information. There were multiple people that died around Calvi's death, and they lured him to London basically under the auspices that they were going to protect him.
I am really glad you brought up the Freemason connection of the investigation, because the Masonic connections are going to keep coming up when it comes to the Vatican Bank.
Yes.
I have notes that said, of course, as you said, originally ruled a suicide, but the fiscal investigation were trying to tie the murder to either the mafia or the P2 Masonic Lodge. And of course, the Italian prosecutors could never conclusively prove the IOR's direct role in money laundering due to access to Vatican records. But the article at the time said the scandal cemented the IOR's reputation as a secretive financial conduit. You think?
Well, in the P2 Lodge, everybody needs to understand the entire purpose of the P2 Lodge was a way to hide meetings in Italy that were pertaining to Operation Gladio. Every hierarchy member of the top echelon of Gladio was a member of the P2 Lodge. So this was Operation Gladio telling you that they murdered Calvi.
Pretty much so. Or somebody wanted us to think that, and I think we do. Okay, a little bit more money laundering allegations. During the papacies of Paul VI and John Paul II, the IOR under your buddy, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who was the head of the bank, they were accused of serving as a tax haven for Italian elites and organized crime. The allegations are that the IOR allegedly opened accounts for figures like Giulio Andreotti, who's a former Italian prime minister, reportedly with a $50 million account, and they facilitated transfers for the Sicilian mafia and other criminal networks. They mentioned Michael Sendono and the IOR secrecy enabled by Vatican sovereignty. Outcome of those investigations, no formal convictions tied to the IOR directly to money laundering, as the Vatican City's legal immunity blocked Italian investigations. Another book to read is some. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
This is from a book
from John Paul I real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
So John Paul I was only Pope for 33 days. And John Paul I was very much interested in the Vatican Bank. And he began immediately asking a whole bunch of questions, some very uncomfortable questions about what was going on inside the Vatican Bank. And he was poisoned with arsenic poisoning. And the way we know that, according to Paul Williams, is the nun that found him, who was also disposed of, she never was heard from again. She was supposedly taken to a nunnery outside of Venice and never to be heard from again. So she had walked into his room first thing in the morning and described his body as bowed up backwards, which is a clear indication that he was poisoned. The only thing touching was like the heels of his feet and the back of his head, and the rest of his body was bowed up. And by the way, that's why we know the people in Jonestown wasn't fed arsenic poisoning, because they didn't look like that. So that all of that's covered up. And Marcinkus was there in charge of the Vatican Bank when all of this happened.
Indeed. Okay, we got some more fun stuff coming. In 2010, we get an Italian investigation into with Moneyball, which is a banking regulator. September 2010, Italian authorities seized 23 million in IOR funds held at an Italian bank called Credito Artigiano as part of a money laundering investigation. Allegations are the prosecutors suspected the IOR of violating Italian anti-money laundering laws by conducting suspicious transactions without disclosing the identities of the account holders. The funds were linked to fictitious accounts, raising concerns about tax evasions or illicit transfers. The investigation targeted Ettore Gatti Tedeschi, who was the IOR president, and Paolo Cipriani, who was the IOR's director, and they were accused of failing to comply with transparency regulations. The investigation outcome, $23 million, was released after the IOR provided additional documentation and no charges are filed due to insufficient evidence of criminal intent. However, this incident prompted the Vatican to create the Financial Information Authority, the AIF, in 2010 under Pope Benedict XVI to align with international anti-money laundering standards. The Moneyval, which is Europe's anti-money laundering evaluation in 2012 to 17, criticized the IOR's lax oversight, but noted progress in reforms such as client screening and transaction reporting. By 2022, Moneyval rated the Vatican substantially effective in anti-money laundering operations.
So,
interesting.
After a whole bunch of investigations that occurred around Calvi's murder, the Italian authorities, even though they didn't have jurisdictions based on investigations that they did of Banco Ambrosiano, which they did have jurisdiction over, they started putting the screws to the Vatican Bank. They started asking a whole bunch of very in-depth questions. That leads the Vatican Bank to basically fire Marcinkus. So Marcinkus comes back to the United States, and because of his involvement, his alleged involvement in all of this, Italy puts out an extradition for Marcinkus. They want him to come back and answer questions. The United States refused to extradite him to Italy. He died a peaceful death in Sun City, Arizona, protected by the U.S. government. Years later. And as a result of all of those accusations, the Vatican Bank agreed to have an annual audit of their books. The annual auditor that they chose was the auditor that the CIA always uses, Price Waterhouse. And none of it was ever disclosed, but they were required to basically tell the Italian officials whether they got a pass-fail. They were never required to disclose, and they have never gotten a passing grade.
They started making reforms. And I should put air
let's
quotes.
talk about that. Hold on just a second. John Paul II. Now remember, John Paul I got assassinated. John Paul II, we all know that he got shot, right? Do you know why he got shot?
Go ahead.
So he got shot because it was found out, and now the Vatican Bank's money laundering for the CIA's drug operations or NATO's drug operations, right? So we've got all these drugs flowing, and they're money laundering for these drug sales. And the Vatican Bank, depending on who you talk to, got 10 to 15% off the top of every dollar that they laundered. So they have this ginormous slush fund of money coming in because, again, these are billions of dollars worth of drug sales every year that the Vatican is laundering money for.
Yeah, and we can't leave out the fact you can't leave out how the Catholic charities are involved in the human trafficking, mostly of Catholic nations coming here, and that has to be part of the story because drug trafficking and human trafficking go hand in hand.
Correct. So John Paul II, being Polish, wanted to work with Solidarity to basically do a backdoor deal with the Soviet Union to allow Poland to have its freedom. Not necessarily extradite it from the Soviet Union, but they wanted to basically funnel some of this slush fund of drug profits that they were banking in through Poland, through the Catholic Church, into the Soviet Union in a backdoor fashion in order to basically, I use the words, buy their freedom, buy more autonomy, if you will. So as soon as, now, again, one of the Operation Gladio golden rules is you're not allowed to deal with the Soviet Union. Remember, JFK had a backdoor to the Soviet Union and to Castro, and that cost him his life. So you're not allowed at all to talk to the Soviet Union, because if you talk to them and they actually deal with you, then they look rational, and you can't have anybody dealing with the Soviet Union. Just like Obama tells Trump he's not allowed to talk to North Korea, because you can't have them actually appearing normal, because if they do and rational, then the CIA can't use them as a boogeyman anymore. So in order to send John Paul II a message that you're not allowed to talk to the Soviet Union, that they hired 2 gunmen, 2 assassins, who were actual Grey Wolf, which is the name of Turkish Operation Gladio units. 2 Grey Wolves come into St. Peter's Square. One of them is acting as a decoy. The other one shoots John Paul II. And the reason why you know it was a warning and not a fatal shot is because he shot him from a couple of feet away. And the guy was a known marksman assassin. If they wanted him dead, he'd have been dropped dead that day.
Yeah, I got the article I had said they were able to funnel $3.5 million in gold from the Italian intelligence agencies to the Solidarity movement. So, yes.
Yeah, and you're not allowed to do that.
No. All right, back to the reforms.
Paul II found out.
Yes. So they do some reforms in about 2010. And the big one was having the Vatican Bank accounts add SWIFT codes to their accounts, which makes for much greater transparency in banking, especially international. Of course, this comes back to bite them. On January 1st, 2013, the Bank of Italy orders the Deutsche Bank Italia, which manage electronic payment services like SWIFT codes and ATM transactions in Vatican City, to suspend all services. This action is allegedly taken because the Vatican had not fully implemented EU anti-money laundering regulations. Basically, it meant that tourists in Vatican operations could only use cash for transactions at the Vatican Museum, essentially shutting off one of their major sources of revenue. You're talking about really putting the squeeze on Vatican City. But there might have been a little bit more to that than meets the eye. Several sources alleged that the IOR was excluded from SWIFT in the weeks before Pope Benedict XIV's resignation, which would come in February 2013. They claim it was a deliberate act to pressure Benedict's resignation, and they were basically treating the Vatican like a terrorist state. And they basically cite the fact that they restored all the SWIFT access to the ATMs as soon as Benedict resigned. And that's what gave us the recently demised Pope Francis. So there's a bit of a conspiracy theory regarding the SWIFT code.
That's interesting.
Uh-huh. There's more to that, but I think, again, it's all speculative, and I don't want to state it as fact, but the timing is pretty interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah. Given all that we know about their money laundering actions. So I wanted to add that when you mentioned Panama and the things that they set up, I want to also point out that the Panama company that the Vatican set up was United Trading Corporation, and they used General Development Corporation, which I've come across a million times in Operation Gladio research, because that company was set up by Paul Helliwell in Miami. And they were using them along with the Banco Ambrosiano as part of the money laundering hubs. So I just wanted to mention that too. It says the Vatican ownership of United Trading Corporation, a Panama registered shell company used for money laundering, was part of a Banco Ambrosiano scandal that led to it being identified. They also used a company called Bellatrix Bellatrix, and another company called Manic, Manic, to funnel the money. So just in case anybody else comes up with those companies and other research.
So it's a really interesting history for what should, I mean, the church has been involved in all kinds of shenanigans. And of course, they can justify it quite often because like when it comes to the human trafficking and stuff like that, because they're trying to spread the word of God or Catholicism all over the world. I'm not necessarily, make a moral judgment or whether the ends justify the means, but I will say I can make a judgment that this is an entity that is in serious financial straits. This is not this all-powerful, hidden, secretive Vatican Bank that the boogeyman that some people make it out to be. The amount of revenues they have are a pittance. It's smaller than the city of Washington, D.C. does $23 billion budget every year. The entire Vatican City is 1/10 of that. Okay, just to put that into perspective. But that is exactly why we now have the first American-born Pope, because they are desperate for American Catholic dollars, donation dollars, and they'll have to make some major changes in the Catholic Church structure if they don't solve this financially.
So let me ask you your opinion on what happened to all of the hundreds of billions of dollars that they were laundering covertly. They're part of it.
I mean, did it get profited in somebody else's pockets? And some of it's probably in artwork, a lot of that. But again, it's a very expensive operation they run. Their bishops and popes and priests live a very lavish lifestyle. They have a pension fund that is absolutely underfunded to the tune of $500 billion underfunded. I mean, that's something that's going to hit them hard, like in the next 5 years. These priests retire with a very lavish pension. It's been malinvested. They are running out of this money. Wherever it went,
but I'm just going to push back a little bit. Malinvested, if they're sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars, and I understand your point about them not wanting to get rid of it, but if they have gotten hundreds of billions of dollars in covert funding, and as you indicate, they've parked that in real estate and in art and stuff like that. I don't see where they're actually, and if they make the decision not to sell any of that because it's ill-gotten gains as far as I'm concerned, then that's on them.
Yeah, that's why I brought up their accounting. They do have who knows how much money of artwork collected over the 2 centuries of plunder. Who knows how much they got from the Crusades. Look, I would like to spend a lifetime in a Vatican vault. That's just a historian's dream. If I could be reborn and spend my whole life just reading everything in there, I'd be happy. That is a treasure of history and art that is just unknowable, but they don't count it as an asset. But I think maybe that's where a lot of it goes. But when you talk about the malinvestment, remember, laundering money is very expensive. There's a lot of middlemen. They get a cut. You end up using shell companies. Some of these shell companies are leveraged. They end up folding. You get caught holding the bag. We cited several examples where the Vatican Bank's connections went under. When you're playing the Ponzi game, sometimes the music stops.
Again, knowing what I know about their schemes, though, when the banks go under, they were already over leveraged, loaning themselves money. So the collapse of the bank doesn't mean that they end up losing money, because the loans have been extended, and many times, just like the savings and loan, when they did the round robin of directors, they were loaning themselves the money at a 9-to-1 ratio.
Well, I think Vatican finances are going to be something I'll be watching very closely. I'm very concerned about that pension fund. That's going to be in the news in the next few years. I agree. Yeah, you can't just call up your retired priest and say, instead of making $150,000 a year, we got to cut you down to $70,000 a year. That's what an American pension fund would do, but they won't.
And what's interesting, though, Brady, is this how we pit them against each other, where the priests are the ones then that begin demanding the reform of the Catholic Church?
Well, it's inevitable. I mean, something's got to give. But let's talk about one of the best reformers.
Yeah, go ahead and piss off all of the priests out there living the life of Riley while you're sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, and tell them they're the ones that have to give up their lifestyle.
Yeah. Okay, and one
I
of the
might
people
have to
really
actually buy popcorn for that one.
Which brings up one of our favorite archbishops, Mr. Carlo Vigano, who we've all seen on the War Room and various other channels, who is Archbishop Vigano. He was the Apostolic Nuncio to the United States from 2011 to 2016, and then the Secretary General of the Governorate of the Vatican City State from 2009 to 11. Became a bishop in 92 under Pope John Paul II. He gained prominence for his role in exposing corruption and misconduct within the Catholic Church. In 2012, he was linked to the VatiLeaks scandal, revealing financial corruption in the Vatican. His 2018 letter accusing Pope Francis and other church leaders of covering up sexual abuse allegations against former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick drew global attention, calling for the Pope's resignation. Well, he's pretty, we've heard him, he's vocal, but I want to share an interview he gave in Italian. This is an English translation he did with a guy named Matteo Di Micheli. I just want to read a few excerpts from this, if I may.
Sure.
Because this ties in, this opens up some new doors. Okay. Blow this up a little bit to make it a little easier to read. Okay, he's talking about McCarrick's associates, Cardinal Farrell, Kupich, McElroy, Worrell, Gregory, etc., and many others have been promoted to high positions in the Vatican and the American Catholic Church, which coincidentally walks arm in arm with the Democrat Party. They said Democratic. I hate when people say that or spell that wrong. It's the Democrat Party. It is not the Democratic. Drives me nuts. Sorry. The party that supports abortion, propagates gender ideology, and more generally, anything that is contrary to the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ. Coincidence? He's making the connection to the Democrat Party and the woke church. Carlo Vigano says, McCarrick's heirs constitute an ultra-progressive subversive network of authority present today in Rome and the U.S. dioceses, and not only there, they are an expression of the deep church, of the corruption of its members, of its complicity in pursuing the same subversive plan with the globalist oligarchy of the New World Order. Has he been watching our shows? To revive the fortunes of the church, it is therefore essential to denounce, prosecute, and remove those who have occupied the hierarchy's top positions in an attempt to demolish her from within. Their behavior constitutes a crime of high treason, and as such, it must be punished. Let me see if I can find it. Okay. He goes on. The question is, how much did the St. Gallen Mafia, the U.S. deep state, and the blocking of the Vatican's electronic payment systems play a role in the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI and the election of Bergoglio? Vigano says, I couldn't say, because what we know about the coup d'etat that brought the usurper Bergoglio to the throne of Peter is partial and fragmentary. A serious and impartial investigation is needed, good luck, which verifies the responsibilities of individuals and above all brings to light the existence, which is incontrovertible, of a single script under a single direction. So he's talking about that Swift conspiracy theory. Moving on, this is a big one. We must also consider that having a pope who acts as the fifth column of the enemy is part of a project brought to light in the 19th century by the Italian Carbonaria secret society. His words, not ours. It is the revolution in Cape and Tiara, called for by the instructions of the Alta Vendita. It is taken up not only by the U.S. deep state and more generally by the international globalist lobby, but also by Chinese communist dictatorship, especially after its entry in the World Trade Organization in 2001. With the liberal conversion of Xi Jinping, educated at King's College London, and therefore close to the circles of Anglo-American Freemasonry. I know you're going to have a lot to say, but should I just go through the paragraph, or do you want me to stop there?
No, go.
As I explained in my recent statement on the Sino-Vatican Secret Agreement, Sino being Chinese, Communist China is considered an indispensable ally of the Davos globalism. After the Sinicization of Western economies with unfair competition from Beijing, it was useful to have the Vatican on its side in order to Sinicize Catholicism as well. In this effort, Bergoglio, McCarrick, Parolin, Zuppi, the Jesuits, and the potentates of the Catholic left, including the community of Saint Diegidio, all played a decisive role that Benedict XVI had tried to counter. That is why Benedict was forced to resign, also through the blocking of the SWIFT interbank system. To make room for an emissary of the woke globalist agenda, it is clear that Bergoglio perfectly achieved what his masters expected of him, starting with the shameful betrayal of those Chinese Catholics who were faithful to the Apostolic See. His effigy in the Gallery of Popes deserves to be covered by a black cloth, as the Venetian Senate did for the Doge Marin Falerio, the betrayer of the Serenissima, beheaded pro crimini pro diantinis. Well, that's a lot of Italian words. In 1355, after having tried to establish personal dictatorships in place of the elective monarchy. One last paragraph. Oh, do you want to, let's stop there. Why don't you give some comment on what he's saying so far?
No, I want you to go ahead. I love every bit of this.
Okay. Like I said, has he watched our shows? He's asked, despite everything, up until Benedict XVI, the papacy tried to block the growing Masonic influence, Freemasonry here, in the Vatican's high spheres. With the advent of Bergoglio, were the doors opened. Carlo Vigano says, with apologies, I must contradict you. Freemasonry had penetrated the Vatican's highest spheres even before the council. The election of Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, who was said to have been initiated in the Masonic lodges when he was an apostolic delegate in Turkey, confirms that the power of secret sects was already present within the church, especially during the last years of the pontificate of Pius XII. What year was Pius XII? Do you remember offhand?
No, I'll look it up, but keep going.
Okay. The audiences with the heads of the Jewish lodge of, here it is, B'nai B'rith, in the Masonic winks, and Paul VI. We too, we more than anyone, are cultivators of man, he said in the allocution in December 65. And more generally, the adaptation of revolutionary principles in the documents of the council show us a church under the direct influence of Freemasonry. The group goes from Cardinal Villot to Cardinal Casaroli, from Cardinal Silvestrini to Pietro Parolin. The latter has earned the public praise of the Freemason Giuliano di Bernardo, who hopes for his election. I would like to point out that all the exponents of the conciliar and synodal church enjoy the appreciation of the lodges, meaning Masonic lodges, which recognize them as promoters of Masonic ideals. This fact alone should be enough to understand their role as fifth columns of the enemy.
So Pope Pius XII was Pope from March 1939 to October 1958. He oversaw the creation of the P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy and all of the rat lines and everything else we just talked about in this entire show.
That interview I just read part of the transcript for was done on May 7th of 2025, less than 2 weeks ago. That is Cardinal Vigano knows everything that is going on.
And it appears that this Pope was born in Italy. So he is an Italian born and bred. So he oversaw the creation and involvement of the Catholic Church in the rat lines as well as all of the drug operations. He was the one that began it.
So when we switch our secret society's homework over to the Masons, we will be circling back to this topic and go into a lot more depth and detail. But I wanted to lay that out there now. So as part of this
As the mic
episode,
drop moment.
yeah. Well, I think pretty much everything that Vigano said is a mic drop moment.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he lays out, that was the perfect summary of everything that we presented today.
I think so.
Because he talks about it being the fifth column. It is. It was integrated into all of the rot of everything that's at the heart of Operation Gladio since World War II.
What's a fifth column? It's another word for a stay behind unit. Exactly what it is. It's
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So he's using the same terminology. He's read a similar history. He's been inside, the College of Cardinals, and he is not shy about saying it. So we'll be saying prayers for Mr. Vigano, Father Vigano, whatever. I don't even know the right terms. I'm not Catholic.
Well, because he was excommunicated, right?
I think they tried to, and it didn't happen. Okay. We'll circle back. Someone give us the answer to that on Twitter or X, whatever. But it was very recent. He was in the church until just recently.
Yes.
He was the one who was calling for Joe Biden to be excommunicated. I remember that.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, this was a lot packed in. We did it in 90 minutes like we thought we might be able to. I think we told a pretty interesting story.
An amazing story. Unfortunately, it's all true.
Yeah, it really is. More to come.
Okay. Oh my gosh. You'll never believe how many it just dropped down, thank God. It was 666.
On which platform?
On my live StreamYard thing, it shows the current people that was watching it. I looked up to say something about what we were going to be going back to next week, and I'm like, oh no, not 666.
Wish you had a screenshot of that one.
Yeah. So, oh gosh, it's back to it. Maybe I can get a picture of it.
Sorry, I got my cross right here. We're good.
Yeah, now they're messing with me. It went to 665 and 667. That's hilarious. Okay. So, next week we will be back to our secret society, normal programming. But I do hope everyone enjoyed this excursion into, but it had tinges of secret society embedded all throughout it. So there's that. Because
it always does.
Yes, it always does, unfortunately. But do you have anything else going on, Brady, that you want to tell everybody about?
Yeah, we did a show yesterday previewing today's Supreme Court hearing. They're basically discussing the cases that got emergency order, or they took it on an emergency basis. We're dealing with birthright citizenship. But what's really being debated, and you can see this from Harris, Trump's Solicitor General, her writings to the Supreme Court, we're talking mostly about the problem with these universal injunctions being put down by lower district judges. So that's being heard today on an emergency basis. We did a preview of it yesterday on my channel. We won't get the decision on that. And I was listening to some of the arguments earlier. I didn't necessarily like the way the questions were going, but the Supreme Court has got a major decision whether they're going to continue to let lower courts act outside their own jurisdiction or not. It's a big deal, and we probably won't have the answer for a few weeks, but I'll be following that one very closely. And but it's worth listening to the preview yesterday. We gave really good background on it. So,
and just in case you guys don't know or haven't went to Brady's channel, he does a lot of constitutional conversations that are amazing. You learn something new every time you listen to him. So I highly encourage you guys not only to follow him on X, but go to his Rumble channel. He makes amazing content.
Thank you for that shout out.
You're welcome.
Until next time, cheers.
Yeah. See you guys next week. Noon next Thursday. Take care.